This conference will now be recorded.
Good to go,
morning,
Alex.
everybody. Good morning. It's Alex here from My Forever Family. Thank you to everybody for joining us again for another webinar, Understanding Emotional Regulation, which I think everybody will find quite helpful. Just a quick word about these webinars. I am going to create a monkey survey today and start sending them out to people so I could get some feedback on the webinars. For us to continue to provide this type of training course to our carers, we need to provide feedback, and so we can get some funding to continue this great work. So I'd really appreciate it if everybody could complete these surveys when you receive them and get them back to me each time. Thank you. Enjoy today's session. Let's try and make it a really fun one, lots of interaction. This is for you guys. We want you to get the most out of it. Thanks, Danielle.
No worries. Thanks, Alex. So today we're going to talk about emotional regulation, and some of the content will link to one of the previous sessions and also some of the sessions coming up. So I've looked down the list and I'm just going to put everybody's mics on. And if anybody's wanting to introduce themselves, or if there's any groups of people from organizations sitting together, let us know. I've turned you all on. Does anyone out there want to introduce themselves? Okay, we might go with a quiet audience, but please use the chat panel. Yeah, use the chat panel and ask any questions that you want to ask throughout the session.
And if anybody doesn't feel confident speaking up, and I totally understand that, we all get nervous sometimes, just send me a little personal message and I'll happily ask a question on your behalf.
Lovely, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to start off with talking about what emotional regulation is and explaining emotional regulation, and then we're going to work through and end up at the end of the session. So we've got about 50 minutes to get through some content, and then we'll have some time at the end that you can ask any questions about anything that's come up today. I'll pause throughout the session. If there's any messages that come in through the chat panel, I'll stop and answer those as we go. So just by definition, emotional regulation happens through a healthy attachment relationship. And it's through that attachment relationship being consistently available, attuned, and nurturing, which creates the foundation for optimal development of our nervous system and our brain. And over time, assisted regulation, which they say was formerly co-regulation, I'm still going to use co-regulation because that's kind of what we know it as, allows a child to learn how to effectively, independently self-regulate. So in saying all of that and putting the definition out there of emotional regulation, I guess we're coming from the platform of the children that we're working with haven't had this early attachment experience, and this is something that we talked about on webinar 1. So in terms of not having that experience, then their ability to regulate is compromised for a number of reasons, both attachment and also through brain development, which happens during that process of attachment. So emotions themselves are important helpers, and they offer us strength and motivation and direction, and they also serve us as a bit of a compass and help us with any emotional warnings that we might need to take heed of to look after ourselves as we move forward in our life. So before we can look at what co-regulation looks like for the children that we work with, we need to think about what self-regulation looks like. And how do we self-regulate? So given the children that we're working with haven't had a secure base prior to coming into care, then they're not going to have the most amazing regulation. And we're going to talk about the whole range of different emotional states that they can present with. But in order to be able to be that base, we need to think about how we self-regulate, and that's how we look after ourselves generally. And this will cross over into the self-care session coming up. But in terms of self-regulation, we do that through rest, we do it through nurture and routine, nurturing our bodies, but having a routine that we follow each day, eating healthy food, singing and dancing, reading, maybe reading in a rocking chair, doing some meditation or doing some exercise. And I'm sure that there's probably a whole host of other things that you can fit in there of things that you generally do to self-regulate. So being that stability and self-regulated, we need that to then produce co-regulation. And when we talk about co-regulation, we're kind of referring to, well, co-regulation in terms of how it develops. We're generally talking about infants. So we'll talk about infants first and then look at how we can transition that into older children and what that actually means for the children that we work with. So for children, that when a baby's born, basically things are either okay or not okay. You know, you're either comfortable and sleeping and looking around or crying. So it's one or the other. And there's little difference between any kind of okay state in those early weeks, months, and then it's the not okay state. But by our interaction with babies, and if we think about what we do in those early weeks, we talk to them and we make lots of eye contact and we rock them and we soothe them and sing and feed and change nappies. And the things that they kind of get from that are learning the differences, or I've got needs and those needs are being met. And if I'm screaming, if my caregiver stays steady and rocks and pats, then I will go to sleep. We also talk to them about other things as well, like when they've got the wet nappy. Oh, you must have a wet nappy. Oh, that must be uncomfortable. Let's get that changed. So in having those conversations, we're teaching them, oh, it's a wet nappy and that's uncomfortable and you must be uncomfortable and therefore we're going to change that. Or, oh, you're hungry. You must be so hungry. Oh, that cry, it's a hungry cry, and helping label what those emotions are. And we do that as children go through toddlerhood as well. And as they're going through toddlerhood, we're labeling even more. Oh, you must be angry. You must be frightened. Oh, that's a big bash, that a big crash or big sound. Oh, that must have scared you. So we're labeling all of those emotions. And I guess we see that as quite age appropriate at the time. And for the average child, it is age appropriate. And that's how they're learning what all the different ranges of emotions are. So children basically through mirroring, through what our expression is to a particular indicator, they're learning then how they should familiarize or respond to different situations. You know, the house is burning down, we're all running out screaming. Oh, that's right, I should run out screaming too. So whatever our responses are, the child tends to mirror when they don't know what that is. So when we have children who haven't had an average experience through attachment development and through mirroring their parent, or that mirroring their parent is not regulated, and as we spoke about in the first webinar, a lot of the parents that we work with are not regulated, and if they were regulated, then we probably wouldn't be working with them. So what their experience of co-regulation has been more co-dysregulation. So they haven't learned, this is what I feel when I'm feeling this, and can move into dysregulation quite easily. So I guess a cue, an example of a really good cue of how we can co-regulate is thinking about being in an aeroplane, and you've got, particularly for the ones that I seem to be on all the time these days, is the little Rex flights, and the flight attendant is sitting at the front of the plane, and they're looking towards you. So recently I was on a little flight between Wollongong and Brisbane, and the way that the escarpment happens in Wollongong, it can be a clear day, but the winds actually make it really bumpy going in and out. And everyone looks to the flight attendant. Are they worried? If they're not worried, then we don't need to be worried. So the flight attendant ends up being a co-regulator for everyone on the flight, particularly for those that haven't flown before, because they don't know what to expect. And it's like, well, if the flight attendant is nervous, then we all should be nervous as well. So an airline attendant is a good example of what co-regulation means. Now, last week I showed this same slide, and I just want to do a quick recap because it will relate to what we're going to talk about next. So thinking about the brain and the brain development, and thinking about the brain stem being the wrist and the spinal cord, limbic region in the middle, and the cortex going over the top, remembering that the amygdala and the hippocampus are in the middle part and the cortex is folding over. So when there's stress sensed here, the amygdala goes off, the lid flips, and there's no connection between reason and the downstairs brain. So for more information about that, refer to webinar 1, and I'll move on from that. But I want to take this analogy with me to thinking about the next stage in terms of the connection between the left and the right hemisphere. And as our brains grow, so we're in that, in the first 6 years is the most of a child's brain growth, but the limbic system is going to be as good as the brainstem that it's built on, and the brainstem is built in utero and in the early 6 months. And then the cortex is based on whatever's going on down here is going to be the strength of this. But also what we get from co-regulation is the actual integration between both sides of the brain. So on the right side of the brain is the feeling brain, and on the left side of the brain is the thinking, the logical kind of planning side of the brain. So what we need to do as we grow is integrate the two sides of the brain, and that's about building some neurotransmitters that go between the left and the right hemisphere. So an example of this is when a child falls over, and that obviously hurt. It hurt in the knee, but the right side of the brain registers that feeling of I'm hurt. And it's the left side of the brain that we want to help label that feeling of hurt, to go, oh, that must have really hurt, or that might make you feel sad, or something like that. Because the children that we work with and care for, when they fall over, they may be angry. I've seen children fall over and then hit the ground or be angry at themselves. And that's about the building the connections between the two sides of the brain, because we want to teach them that it's okay that when you feel this pain, it equals feeling sad or feeling hurt. And that helps build those pathways in between the two hemispheres. And we call that correcting to redirect. So correct to redirect. And in helping a child regulate or understand that, or begin to put the emotion with the feeling and help label those emotions, is to say things to them like, I wonder if you're feeling, to give them some ideas about what that might mean, and helping them integrate across the two sides of the brain. So that's one concept, and I'm going to move on to the next concept, and then we're going to tie them all together as we move through. So the next concept is, so the information about, horizontal integration came from Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel also talks about the window of tolerance, but a lot of other researchers and clinicians talk about the window of tolerance as well. Pat Ogden, Babette Rothschild, it's all the center of a lot of work about regulation. And it's really a really useful image. Again, I referred to a Nick Cabin slide in one of the previous webinars, and this is from the same site. So this is talking about the window of tolerance, and if you look in the middle where there's that lovely window picture, is where we like to be for most of the time. And for most of us, we're there in that space most of the time. It means that something can happen and we can shake it off and we can move on. So our brain and our emotions help us right ourselves to be able to move forward and to move on to our next task without as much disruption. When people, children in terms of our work, experience trauma, this can shrink the size of this window. So when the window is smaller, then there's not as much room to be able to tolerate changes or differences or things like that. And we find that the children that we're working with sit right on the top of a very narrow window. So it doesn't take much to trigger them to go up into the next level of dysregulation. So I want to give you an everyday example of what dysregulation looks like for the average person. And then we're going to transfer that to the children that we work with and care for. So an example might be trying to get out the door. You know that you're going somewhere, you're running late, and you can't find your keys. So you're running around the house madly, not really thinking about too much, just looking for all the usual key hiding spots or wherever you think you leave them for, 80% of the time. So any of those, safe places that you've put your keys. So you're running around looking for them, thinking I really need to get going, I'm running late. All of this talk and haste is going through your mind. Now, if somebody came up to you at that point in time and said, okay, just calm down and take a deep breath, what do you want to say to them? I'm going to use that as a rhetorical question because you probably don't want to say that out loud right now. We want to tell them where to go. We actually don't want to take a deep breath because being told to calm down is not a very useful way of actually managing our emotions. So we get to the point where even more stressed because we want to say something mean to that person that told us to calm down. And then, third search through the handbag, tipping it upside down, they fall out and they've got the keys. So you're taking those keys and you're running out the door. And as you're running out the door, that person says, on your way home, can you bring some milk? Do you remember the milk? Generally not. So the reason why we don't remember the milk is because we move into this stage of dysregulation. We move up the scale. We're outside of our window of tolerance and we're dysregulated. So at that point in time, we might move slightly into hyperarousal, but we're dysregulated because we want to swear at somebody. And at that point in time, our memory is actually impacted. So we forget the milk. Now, the next part of the story is get out, get to wherever you're going. You're a little bit late, but you overcome that. And then you get home and you've forgotten the milk. And then the person that asked you about the milk said, you're an idiot. I can't believe you forgot the milk. It's ridiculous. You never remember everything. It's, you've got to make some changes in your life. You've got to get your stuff together and you're not going out this weekend. I don't think you should go out with your friends. I think you should actually take some time out and consider how you can make your life more organized so you don't forget your keys and you don't forget the milk and you can function. It adds a lot of shame and it also makes us feel really bad about ourselves. And the reality is, clinically, we actually can't remember the milk because we're outside of our window of tolerance and our memory is impacted. So if we think about the children that we're working with, they're sitting at the very top of their window of tolerance. And every time they go upwards, it's very quick. And generally when they reach this hyperarousal, and you can see the volcano, the meltdown, they actually have very little memory of what's happened in that time. It's hard for them to recollect that. And just yesterday, one of my colleagues was working with a boy and he was 14, and she went to pick him up and he was going to see mum, and she was picking him up from the carer's house, 14, but obviously a very traumatized child. The carer had given him a list of things. So he needed to use the carer's key, he needed to get himself home, he needed to get inside, he needed to get changed, get a jumper, and get the Mother's Day present. And then he needed to lock the carer's keys in the house because he didn't need them to go to contact. So he did those things. He went inside, he got himself changed, he got his jumper, he had the Mother's Day present in his hand, he went back to put the keys inside, he put it down, he came outside, he locked himself out and realised if he got his present. At that point, he felt so distraught and upset that he went into this hyperarousal. He'd gone through dysregulation, he'd gone up to hyperarousal. He was holding his head in his hands, he was rocking himself, and he was hitting himself in the head. And he became so escalated and distressed about forgetting the Mother's Day present and calling himself names, that they had to call the caseworker and get the caseworker to calm him down and say that it's okay to forget things. If we think about that scenario just for a moment, he's already, before even locking the keys in the house, he's already outside of his window of tolerance and in dysregulation because he's already worked up about going to see mum. And that's okay, he can cope with that. But then the additional stress of leaving the present behind, he felt like he was letting his carer down and that she had given him a list of 3 things to do. And, you know, quite likely the carer would be unfazed by this. But for him, the expectation that he would have actually completed those 3 things, he would have had his present for his mum, was too much for him to cope with. And he reached this state of hyperarousal and curled himself up in a ball and was hitting himself. So that's an example of going outside the window of tolerance, upward. And I say that one first because generally that's what we see first. We see the children in meltdowns, and it's the children with the externalizing behavior that we probably notice more. It's the squeaky wheel gets the oil as opposed to the calmer or what appears to be quieter. So heading down the other side of the window of tolerance is the depressive side. So this can be going quiet, and a little boy that I'm working with in a therapeutic sense, he actually goes both directions, but often he goes down to this point where he disassociates and he can appear to just be in a freeze state or in some kind of trance at different times when his body is so stressed. So he goes very quiet and then he goes into a freeze state. People might recognize this lower dysregulation as that shutting down, particularly after significant grief or loss. They're wanting to just stay in bed, not feeling like interacting with people. And yeah, so that sense of depression is on that bottom end. And then the hypoarousal on the bottom end is that zoning out. So there is actually another level clinically above the hyperarousal, and that one is almost to the point, similarly to the bottom one, where you go so high that you can point that the whole body starts to shut down. So again, it's one of those reptilian responses. And I used to work with a boy that was a refugee, and he would, the volcano would erupt. It erupted for a significant amount of time, and then he would go into a shutdown mode, and he would actually end up in the fetal position. He would wet himself, and then he would sleep. So his whole body just shut down at that other end of that window of tolerance. He was so far outside that he would shut down. And then as he woke up, he would have to come back down through these stages to get to a calm state where he could function and talk again. Okay, before I go on, I just want to see if there is any questions from anyone at this point in time, or any comments with anything that I've said so far. Feel free to add something in the chat, or I've got one person that I muted because it was a bit noisy. I'll just unmute everybody. Okay, any questions so far, comments? No, okay. Okay, so I'll move on to the next part. So I guess I've talked through the theory in terms of what happens in the brain when we're dysregulated, or when a child that we care for or work with is dysregulated. Now I'm going to talk about how do we help them regulate, which is probably the bit that you're all hanging out for. So the first part of this comes from Dan Hughes. So this is PACE, and PACE is talking about being playful, being accepting, being curious, and having empathy. And we're going to talk through this in a couple of webinars time when we talk about therapeutic parenting as well. And I guess what I'm saying about this is, often we think about, okay, so there is a meltdown, we're at the volcano, it's all happening, and we're thinking about, well, how do we manage that particular scenario? There are a couple of ways of managing that particular scenario, but what is actually more important is the time in between those meltdowns, and how we can assist a child. And if I go back to the window of tolerance, assist a child to stay in their window, or make that window a little larger in the time in between the meltdowns, to reduce the severity, but also to reduce the frequency of the meltdowns in between. So thinking about PACE, thinking about being playful, so engaging in whatever the child is in and making a game out of it. So one of my colleagues had an example of a child starting a fire and coming in with, and this is, you know, quite an extreme example, but oh, we're going to play the matches game. Okay, how are we doing this? And turning in whatever is going into a redirection in terms of making what's happening, engaging in the no, don't do that, that's not okay, that's not safe. Instead of doing that, engaging in where they're at and changing it into a redirection into something that is more safe, and redirect them out of the dangerous thing that they're doing, or whatever's going on for them at the time. So the challenge for you is being regulated enough in those times to be able to redirect in a safe way to move a child out of that space at the time. So using playfulness, but also using acceptance. And I guess when we're thinking about acceptance, is to think about this window of tolerance, or to think about the example of the car keys. What do we want to hear in that time that we're at the top of our window? What do we want to hear when we come back into our window? We want to hear something that's nurturing, rather than consequences, punishment, and things that we don't have any control of. So being accepting is really thinking about, how are we going to manage what's happening at the edge of this window? what's happening in the dysregulation and hyperarousal, and then how are we going to manage coming back into the window? How are we going to respond to that behaviour afterwards that is actually nurturing and encouraging and positive? And thinking about that unconditional positive regard, where everything we say to a child is positive, and even if it's about a redirection to something else that's positive in that situation rather than what's going on right here and now. Some other ways of thinking about, I missed curiosity. So curiosity is those questions. So I spoke of before about I'm wondering if you're feeling sad right now, or I'm wondering if this is what angry feels like, or disappointed, or some other range of emotions. I'm wondering if you're worried about something specific rather than what's actually happening at the time or what the child is doing. And then having empathy. And I think my favourite kind of reference to empathy comes from Brené Brown. She's a social worker, researcher, and she talks about empathy in terms of the feeling with instead of the sympathy content of oh, you poor dear. Or I love her reference to actually starting with sympathy starts with, well, at least. And I think if you think of any time that you've said something that's happening to you that's really sad or hurtful or something like that, and somebody says, oh, well, at least you've got whatever, it's the last thing that you want to hear. So being empathy is about feeling with, and often it might be, I don't think that there are any words for how you're feeling, and I don't know how you're feeling right now. But what do you think, or how do you think we can help you feel better in this situation? So things that we can do that are paceful and working through the time in between those meltdowns. So the times that they're generally sitting in this window of tolerance, but might be sitting at the higher end, but also expanding that window of tolerance, is using unconditional positive regard. But also physiological things that help with the brainstem and the vestibular system. So things like rocking. If we think about just sitting in a rocking chair and rocking, how soothing that is for us. Swinging, being in the park and just swinging on a swing. It's great for our vestibular system and it's really soothing. Jumping. Jumping is a very physical activity, and I would suggest trampolines are a godsend in terms of getting some energy out. And if you're thinking about the meltdown goes up and increases in energy, if there's another way to get that energy out, it's through jumping, so that high physical intensity exercise. So going and jumping on a trampoline for 10 minutes can make all the difference between being regulated and being dysregulated. What can make a bigger difference is actually factoring that 10 minutes in regularly. So every afternoon, straight after school, it's 10 minutes of jumping before we settle down and have a snack and move into an evening routine, or doing it twice a day. So not only what does increase our window of tolerance is not only doing the regulative activity, but doing it regularly. So having set times of the day that activity is engaged in to help. So jumping, spinning is another good one. And I think, I know it's going back a little bit, but when I was a kid in parks, we used to have those like ball shaped things that you sat in, and it had the metal wheel in the middle and you turned it and, you spun, and it was really cool. And then I think they were maybe like a physical hazard or something. So we don't necessarily have them so much anymore, but merry-go-rounds are a good spinning, and the good old desk chair. And I'm going to revert to my years working in child protection and thinking about children that had just been removed and were in the office and about to go to a placement. the power of a desk chair, of just spinning a child. And I think we did it just intuitively because they laughed and it was fun. But now we know clinically that the reason why they laughed and it was fun is because it's great for the vestibular system and it's regulating. So spinning around, a carer that I was training a couple of weeks ago, she said one of the children she cares for, they lay on their tummy on the desk chair and they spin the desk chair around like that. Floating, and I would say any immersion in water is fantastic for regulation. And I think I mentioned this the other day, but in terms of water and being immersed in water, if we think about that feeling of weightlessness, but also that feeling of security, that we're totally wrapped and immersed in something that is maintaining our weight. So water is really regulative. And if we think about just our own self-care, baths are something that we tend to do. But when children grow and they become more independent, we send them in for a shower. And the shower is quick and it's time efficient and it can be water efficient if it's quick. But actually the therapeutic benefits of putting a child in a bath at night is fantastic for regulation. It's really calming. You're using some other things in that bath, like a bit of lavender or some Epsom salts or something that helps bring down and is regulative for the body, can be something that is really good. So a little boy that I work with, he has been diagnosed with ADHD and we've just introduced baths. So I'm doing EMDR therapy, but we've introduced baths. So he's having a bath every second night to decrease his arousal levels, and already it's making a significant difference to just how he's functioning during the day. For one of the children that I used to work with, she was 12 and highly dysregulated for most of the time and very much outside of her window of tolerance. She was diagnosed with an intellectual delay as a result of her experience of trauma, but just her level of hyperarousal that was so consistent that she actually couldn't learn anything. So her mother's words were, she has the mind of a 5-year-old at 12, which wasn't correct. She had some learning delays, but she was so aroused during the day, all day, through school, even at night when she slept. Her trauma occurred while she was asleep, so she would be woken, so going to sleep wasn't safe. There was nothing about her day that was really safe for her, so she wasn't learning. What we did is put her in the pool, and we had 2 sessions a day in the pool, where when we're in the pool, we learned fractions and we learned to tell the time and all of these things that she had been considered of incapable of learning. She learnt quite well in the water because she was regulated enough and within her window of tolerance. So if there was conversations to be had that were difficult, they usually happened in the water because it was a space where she was regulated enough to be able to be in her window and hear that information and process it and remember it. And memory is a massive thing for children with trauma, particularly because they spend so much time outside that window of tolerance. So it's very difficult for them to retain information. Pets. Pets are a fantastic regulator. So just sitting there and patting. And I'm mindful that for some of you and the children you care for may not be entirely safe around pets, but for some children it's a really good distraction, and just that padding and the feeling of the fur, that tactile sense is enough to regulate. But also having a pet lie on you, and it's kind of the perfect example of co-regulation really, because for the most part the pet that comes and lays on you is fairly relaxed and comfortable laying on you. So if you've got a pet that will lay with a child, the regular heartbeat of the pet and the softness of their fur can be regulating for the child. Obviously with pets like rabbits, They easily start also if the child's too dysregulated. That's not going to work. But I guess, again, the key is introducing this regulation when the child is reasonably regulated, and doing this frequently in their good times will actually lower the intensity of the difficult times. And all of these kinds of regulative activities, they're actually going back to that brain and growing the neurotransmitters between the left and the right side of the brain in that horizontal integration. So that swinging, the rocking, the floating, being in water, all of those kinds of things. One of my favorite ones for the swinging is the hammock chairs that have just got the one bolt that goes up to the roof and then comes down and almost immerses the child entirely encapsulated within that swinging. It can swing in any direction, so it's rocking, swinging, but it's also holding the child with some sense of compression as well, which is also very regulating.
So, hi Danielle. So does that mean that if we continue to do these soothing, calming, relaxing activities, they have a cumulative effect on the brain?
Yeah, they do. Brain? So if you think of just yourself and how you as a human, sorry, just unmuted everybody. So if you've got some activity going on, just feel free to mute yourself. So if you think about yourself and how you feel generally within yourself, and you go to yoga twice a week, and then a whole bunch of stuff happens, and you don't get to go to yoga anymore, how do you feel differently?
Yeah, right. You start to feel, less connected with things and.
Yeah. So if you've got this, like I know personally, and I wish I did it more, that the day after I've been to yoga, I feel like anything could just wash over me. Any level of stress can just wash over me, because I've been to yoga and I've had that really good stretch, and I've opened up and I've done some really good breathing, and breathing is what we're going to talk about next. But in introducing these little things regularly throughout every day, it's actually opening up their window of tolerance. So for me, the day after yoga, my window of tolerance is huge. You could say pretty much anything to me and I feel okay about that and can move on. But, you know, last week when I had children's court clinic assessments due and overdue maybe, and marking for uni to be done, and all of that going live, and all of those things all happening, I was working long hours and I was eating rubbish. And, you know, if anybody said something to me by the end of the week, I think I would have just totally lost it. And that's because my window of tolerance has just shrunk up to almost nothing. So it really is about the time in between the meltdowns, that we can introduce as many regulative activities as possible that will help the meltdowns to make them less frequent and less significant when they come around. Did anybody else have any other thoughts about that while we're chatting? Sounded like somebody tried there. But if you do, feel free to stick something in the chat panel there and we can talk about it some more. So thinking along those lines, and I guess one of those keywords in there was being repetitive. So when you think about, you know, going to yoga twice a week, you go to yoga twice a week and it can maintain the window of tolerance being more open. So the key there is getting that routine going to make it the same. So another example is having regular story time. And that can be hard if you've got lots of different children and you're trying to quarantine that time every night. But often it's not just the reading the story, but reading the same story. The same story is really predictable and it's repetitive, and repetition and predictability are regulating. So we often know that we say, oh, what story do you want to read tonight? And they'll pick the same book that you've read 20 times. And that's because it is predictable and regular, and it does help with emotional regulation, but just the proximity and sitting in that space and doing that regularly is actually developing those regulative skills that we need to have. So thinking about some other ways of being regulating, I'm going to introduce a couple of regulative activities that you can do with kids to help them. And I guess one of those fundamental things in yoga is about the breath and the use of breath. So using a deep blowing breath, and particularly a consistent blowing breath, is coming right down from the diaphragm. So we obviously want to get that breath coming right down from the bottom of the diaphragm. So blowing things is a really good way to introduce breathing. And I guess if anybody has been to clinical sessions or something and they've been given activities such as, the triangle breathing or the square breathing, where they have to trace out the, the square in and out and hold and in and out. They're great and they're good to practice when they're already regulated. But often if you say you're practicing breathing activities, that's like saying, "Oh, just calm down, yeah?" It's not really going to be as helpful as doing activities that involve breathing. So one of them is the feather blow. So here's a feather. I'm blowing a feather between us and someone else. To get the feather to go the distance between me and to a child, I have to actually blow consistently for a period of time. You notice if I do a quick breath, it actually just sinks straight to the ground. So to get a feather to go the distance, we actually need to do a long and consistent breath, which means we need to breathe really deeply. So that can be really helpful for children. The other thing that we can do to encourage breathing is blowing some bubbles. Now we all know that blowing bubbles, and now I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of detergent on my desk, is fun for kids. So what they tend to do is run around and try and pop them or try to catch them. And that's great. That's a fun game. It's actually up-regulating. So if you do have a child that is flatter or internalizes, blowing bubbles and getting them to pop them or clap and get them together or try and catch them and run around a bit, that's up-regulating. But getting the child to blow the bubbles for you is actually down-regulating, and that's using the breath to control the breath and getting the breath out. So intercepting a meltdown with blowing bubbles, first of all, the bubbles is a distraction. If you've got a child who's escalating, you can just do you know what? I'm going to start the bubble game and just blow bubbles for yourself. The bubbles is a distraction because they want to dance in them. They want to clap them, they want to poke them, and they want to squash them and all of those kinds of things. So they can get the rest of their upward regulation out by catching the bubbles and popping the bubbles and being destructive with the bubbles can get the rest of the high energy out. But then getting them to blow the bubbles can bring them back down again. So bubble blowing is a really good one for interception at meltdown point, but also, and it's something we don't think of because, at meltdown point, we're all kind of ready to melt down at that point, but it's a good interception to come in and blow the bubbles, get them distracted. So if you think about connect and redirect, we're connecting with, we're redirecting. The issue with being outside of the window of tolerance is often the brain has gone back into the past. So we want to bring them into the present. So things like blowing a feather around or blowing bubbles around is actually a reconnect to then redirect from where they're headed off. Ring a Rosie is one of those popular songs, but it's in here pretty much as an example of the kind of impact just singing and dancing has. with children. So singing has a special impact because if we go back to that hand model of the brain and we have the amygdala in the middle, what sits around the outside of the amygdala is the cingulate, and the cingulate is the off switch for the amygdala. And to stimulate that cingulate, to turn the amygdala off and bring the brain back together, is often melody. So using a melodical voice, singing, playing music is a regulator. So, and if we think about when we're stressed and we're in the car and we play our music really loud, that's actually regulating. So listening to music is regulating. Playing music just before bed, or so down regulating music, or using up regulating music might match the intensity of the meltdown that you're at. So you want to come up at that height with something positive. We've got the height of the meltdown, so we want to come up with some loud music and match intensity, but the music is regulating. It attracts to the cingulate, and then the cingulate is the off switch. So any kind of music and dancing is regulating. So kids that can do or engage in music or dancing, it is really regulating. We find that young people that develop a talent around any form of music do well moving forward if they've got that outlet to help them regulate. Jumping, I talked about the jumping on the trampoline and how regulating jumping is just jumping on a trampoline, the same as swinging and rocking and those kinds of things, but jumping is good to get that energy out to move up before you can come back down again. Just got a bibliography around some of the places where the resources came from, and now I'm going to put it out to everybody. Everybody is open to be able to talk, and I'm keen if anybody has any questions that they want to ask, feel free to pop them through the chat panel, or anything that they found particularly useful. Please let me know. It's been a very quiet group today.
It has been quiet.
So I feel like I've talked incessantly there about.
I could just confirm, having a big trampoline in the garden, the trampoline is just worth gold. Also, when we're waiting for my husband to come home for dinner, if the kids are getting restless and hungry, I just send them out on the trampoline. 10 minutes on the trampoline just does the trick, and it's just really worth gold. It's just absolutely great to have that outlet. And I've had kids that wanted to communicate and could only communicate when they're swimming with me in the water or riding in the car, because they wouldn't have the face-to-face contact. And swimming to each other just brought out a lot of stuff as well. So it's just great outlet now. I must say that I can just confirm everything you said. It's pretty.
I'm glad, Irina.
To have these outlets is just really worth gold, because it just helps on the day-to-day routine.
So it's also just about, like Irina said, doing that at that particular time of day is helpful at that time of day. So really realizing which things work for the child that you're working with or caring for, and being able to do them regularly enough and setting that into the routine to kind of keep that that schedule going and to keep that consistency in regulation. So often children do come home from school either up-regulated or down-regulated, depending on their day, and working out what's the bit that's going to help them just lift up to be in a nice space in window of tolerance, or what's going to help them get rid of all of that energy and come back down. And that might be some quiet sitting, bubble blowing, starting off blowing the bubbles yourself, or encouraging them to blow some bubbles just to come into that nice space, or reading a story, engaging in that space, or just blowing or jumping or doing something hardcore to get rid of that energy. Any other thoughts or comments?
I really liked the window of tolerance thing that you explained, and how because I've heard that before, the window of tolerance, and I've seen it before, but I haven't heard it as the more you do it, the more it widens that window, because I've heard over and over, do more of it, and I'm always like, okay, I'll do more. I don't know why I'm doing it, but I'm doing it anyway. But now I understand why, because it's widening it not for them, so they can have that widened window, but also for ourselves. So you go, oh, that's why it's so easy on those days when I just go, okay, yeah, whatever's going to fly, because I'm regulated at the moment. So good. And then other days when I'm not regulated, I'll go, oh, my window is very, very small today. I can go, oh, that's what it is. Okay, right. And I can do that for my child. So thank you for explaining that, because that to me, I was going, oh, I've heard this so often, I just didn't put that, I didn't understand about widening the window thing. So thank you for explaining that. That was really good.
Great, Tina. I'm glad that was useful for you. But yeah, really important to try and widen that window, because our kids come with like the minusculest window and really sit in the top space for so long. So, but I'm really glad that you're doing some of those things intuitively, or keeping following doing those things to for a purpose that you didn't know about yet. Just a couple of things that have come through in the chat. Yes, the slides will go out again. I'll forward them on to Alex, so you can get a copy of those. It's got the references in it as well. And as I said, the Nick Cabham slide is really useful for the window of tolerance. It's also super useful to even show kids as they're getting older, so they know where exactly they're sitting on the window at any particular time. It really helps them think about their own emotional regulation, and the more they understand what the volcano looks like or feels like on the inside, if you can talk about it after big meltdowns, they can start identifying some of those feelings that are heading up into that dysregulated space, to be able to manage those things. So when I'm feeling this, I'm up into dysregulation and I need to go and jump. And for some of the children that I've worked with, that's been the biggest thing about having that analogy with the volcano and talking about, can you feel the lava rising? When the lava's rising, what's going on inside your body, and getting them to be able to identify that. So a child that had some very amazing meltdowns, including putting knives at his throat and all sorts of things, he actually has no meltdowns anymore, and he's able to regulate his behaviour, just learning those phases and what's happening for him going upwards. Thank you, Leanne, for your comment about jumping and spinning, and I'm glad that it will be useful for you. And I'm so glad that you do have your trampoline, Carmen. And thank you, Heather. That's great. I've got a little question in there. Yeah. Great. Okay. It looks like we've covered off everything that's on the list, and I really thank you for being present today, and look forward to our next session coming up on Friday.
I'm getting a lot of feedback, Danielle, so I might get you to mute everybody.
Oh, yeah, muted everybody, but I'll just close off and thank you all for being here today, and look forward for anybody that's coming in again on Friday. And I'll stop the recording now.